President David, members and guests, I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Eric Easton. The subject of Eric's talk is ethics. At our weekly meetings, we're reminded that Rotary promotes ethical behaviour in business. Indeed, one of the four objects of Rotary is to, quote, encourage and foster high ethical standards in business and professions. Of course, each of us, each day, makes choices and decisions, large and small, and they are based on our own personal sets of ethics. However, in the time that I've been a member of Rotary, which is about 25 years, I have not ever heard a speaker talk specifically about ethics. Eric is very well qualified to speak today by his distinguished career in the accounting profession, as he was responsible for many investigations on behalf of clients who had suffered because of unethical behaviour, negligence and fraud. He was often called as an expert witness and appeared in some very high-profile trials which resulted from unethical behaviour. Eric has also written a book which is used in educational programs. It is titled Ethics in Business and focuses on the influences which shape our decisions, our behaviour, and is illustrated by many case studies. Please welcome Eric Easton.
Well, thank you, Irvin, and thank you very much indeed for inviting me to come and talk to you. I wonder what you would see that the following items share in common. ISIS and the events of the past weekend in Paris. The diesel engine scandal engulfing Volkswagen. The abuse of children. Money in sport. The beginning and end of life issues, abortion and euthanasia. Well, in one way or another, they all involve ethics and the worldviews on which they are based. So what are ethics? In short, they are the standards, rules or laws governing our decision-making in how we should act in life, in our relationships with one another, socially, nationally, and internationally, in order to pursue as the desirable goals of life happiness and what is good. But what exactly is good, since this is influenced significantly by our worldviews and by our personal desires, which often differ one from another? Consider this timeless statement of life's primary goal and ethics to achieve it from Psalm 34. First, the life goal, and then, in just 4 lines, a summary of the ethics to achieve that. What man is there who desires life and loves many days that he may see good? Keep your tongue from evil and your lips from speaking deceit. Turn away from evil and do good. Seek peace and pursue it. Well, who would disagree with that? Interesting, though, isn't it, the primacy that is given in the psalm to the ethics of our spoken words? Because, of course, it was the primary means then by which most people communicated with each other. It was, more than today, the key element of being humanly in touch. Your word was your bond, and it determined who you ultimately were and what you stood for. But what about the worldview? And I'm going to focus today on worldviews, the belief system upon which life goals and the ethics of Psalm 34 are based. The immediately preceding verse to the ones I read describe it in one line. Come, O children, listen to me, I will teach you the fear of the Lord. That is to respect, revere, trust, follow, obey, and love. In other words, a monotheistic worldview. The testing issue is, Do we live out the ethics we profess to follow? Are we virtuous, persons of integrity, or are we occasional members of the Hypocrites Club? Ethics is a large and at times complex subject. Since I can't possibly do justice to it in the 15-20 minutes I've got, what I will attempt to do is to cover the following three. First of all, the hugely significant shift of the essential worldviews in the Western world on which our ethics rest. Two, the procedure for ethical decision-making, and probably the most important ethic of all, that of truth. I start with my first point, that of the significant shift of the essential worldviews in the Western world on which our ethics rest. Most of us, in my generation, born 1937, learnt the rudiments of ethics at our parents' knees, later reinforced at school and church, and the contextual worldview at that time was predominantly that of Judeo-Christian monotheism. This provided the framework on how we were to behave and to be like God in virtue, for which read ethics, that was revealed in commandments, rules, etc. We learnt about accountability, respect, and love for God and other people, including our enemies. Well, this may seem all rather quaint and unscientific to our current secular minds, 400 odd years on from the Enlightenment, which emphasized reason and individualism rather than tradition. Further, a century and a half after the publication of Charles Darwin's book on evolutionary theory, the general secular worldview has dispensed with a sovereign creator God as the originator, foundation, and judge of human ethical decisions, to one of scientific naturalism and ethics involving human reason, in which humankind were left free to formulate their own standards and rules of ethics, which they have done and continue to do. Truth in the new worldview has become subjective, not objective or absolute. I think the best way that I can highlight for you the changes which flowed from the Enlightenment is to point you to a document of the Founding Fathers in the United States of America titled Principles of Freedom, which they stated must be understood and perpetuated by every people who desire peace, prosperity, and freedom. These principles played a significant part in the framing of the USA Constitution and their subsequent Bills of Rights. At the head of the list is this one: the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations is natural law. In other words, all rules of ethics must have their foundation in natural law. But this begs the question of what natural law is, and if there is more than one, which one? If there is a natural law, one would naturally assume that it was fixed and unchanging. And this is important because there are some significant changes in ethical norms going on at present, particularly in the area of sexual relations and freedom of speech. Natural law is the unwritten body of universal moral principles that underlie the ethical and legal norms by which human conduct is evaluated and governed. That's the definition given to it in the legal dictionary. There are three recognized schools of natural law theory. The first, divine, the system of principles believed to have been revealed by God and typically reflected in religious writings. The second, secular, the divine laws of God are replaced with the physical, biological, and behavioral laws of nature as understood by human reason. The third, historical, That's the law made to conform to the well-established but unwritten customs, traditions, and experiences that have evolved over the course of history. Which one of the theories of natural law can be claimed to be the only reliable basis for sound government and just human relations? Our current society probably draws from all three, but without according any of them absolute objective status. This can and does present difficulties where legislation involving ethics is based solely on secular or historical principles of natural law, denying citizens who hold fast, for example, to the primacy of divine principles of natural law, the right to behave differently. This currently, as you'll probably be aware, is the issue in laws relating to abortion, same-sex marriage, and certain prohibitions against discrimination. So, if divine natural law, which encourages and fosters respect and honour to the lawmaker and the governing state, is abandoned as the objective, absolute truth foundational to ethics, what is to take its place to achieve the same purpose? Dictators, regulations with strong penalties, programs of terror such as that used by ISIS? If I was to ask you all to compile a list of laws as commandments, no more than, say, 10, I wonder what you'd include to achieve the goal of security and happiness on a national basis. I'm fairly sure you would include at least commandments dealing with murder, theft, untruthfulness in communicating. That's commandments 6, 8, and 9 in the Bible. If you believe the core unit which determines the strength of any society is the family, whose integrity should be protected, and that, by the way, is number 28 in the USA Principles of Freedom that I mentioned earlier, you may want to include in your list Commandment 7 about not committing adultery. You also may, if you wanted to prevent breaches of the commandments before they arose in people's minds, include Commandment 10 against coveting anything belonging to your neighbour, including his wife. But faced with the difficulty in a secular worldview of enforcing, let alone monitoring such a rule, you may decide to leave it off your list. But I wonder what commandment you'd have on your list to address the real and growing problem we have in our society of a lack of gratitude, of respect for authority in whatever form it's found. Respect, for example, for the Australian nation and its values, for law enforcement officers. If you were a deep thinker about consequences, you may be persuaded to include Commandment 5 here about honouring father and mother, and trust that honouring and respecting other authorities would flow from that. But secular ethics, as I see them today, admits two ethical requirements that are motivations for keeping all the commandments in the first place. The first of those are of respect, loyalty, and obedience to the lawmaker, with time set aside to reinforce that. Dictatorships or other forms of brutal regimes seek that honouring and obedience through terror and force. Ever-increasing welfare in a democracy like ours isn't the solution, and I don't know what would be in a secular society. The second summarizes in a positive way all the commandments relating to relationships with other people in the requirement to love our neighbour as ourselves. Well, perhaps a Bill of Rights here and responsibilities would take their place in a secular worldview. Robert Hulls, former Deputy Premier in the state of Victoria, seems to think so. In an article published in the Herald Sun 2 weeks ago, titled "Human Rights Must Be the Compass for Our Way of Life," Hulls wrote, "Without doubt, we live in confusing and frightening times. Now, more than ever, we need fundamental principles to guide us, to remind us who we are as a nation, who we tell others are, and who we actually want to be. A national charter of rights and responsibilities would function as that map, one which, rather than compelling compliance in every instance, insists each decision is considered and justified through a human rights lens. I must confess, I got quite excited when I first read that headline and saw the word responsibilities. At last, I thought, instead of just self-seeking rights with little care for others, we will have responsibilities to cover that. Not so. Responsibilities, as described by Howells, are to be limited in the proposal to government councils, agencies, to ensure that any laws or regulations that they pass and that affect individuals meet with the requirements of the Bill of Rights. So loving our neighbour or the government who introduced and monitor the Bills of Rights, well, nothing there. Could a Bill of Rights include rights for a government to be respected and loved? I doubt it. Now, today, 67 years after the United Nations Bill of Rights was voted on and enshrined, human rights have little, if anything, to say explicitly about our individual duties or responsibilities, except perhaps by default implicitly expecting all citizens to respect and implement the rights of others. The problem is that ethical decisions based on human rights in our Western society tend to encourage ethical freedoms to suit our self-interest and desires, which generally do not countenance an absolute authority figure as the norm or standard for our ethics. However, mankind seems to have an inbuilt desire for authority over them, which at present we are seeing as being filled by radical ideologies and weakening of our democratic political systems. Our innate desire to act ethically has always faced constant pressures or temptations to favour and promote our narrow self-interest over the interest of others, and thereby to act unethically, or at least less ethically than would be appropriate in circumstances. These temptation pressures include, for example, greed, wanting a bigger share of the pie, lust for power to control others as to have your own way, sexual lust involving ignoring or rationalizing ethical standards of care, fidelity, and veracity, to bolster or maintain a desired image for public approval, and lastly, minimizing the harm or exaggerating the good that may flow from any decisions we make. In the past, such self-interest was regulated partially by the natural law, our innate sense of right and wrong, and by worldviews, which until 200 or 300 years ago included the monotheistic belief through which revealed commands, ethical commands and standards encouraged responsibility and selflessness. But such worldviews have changed, and with it the restraining leash of the monotheistic worldviews. One final word about changes to worldviews following the horrific events in Paris. We shouldn't assume that secular ethics, which dominate in the West today, will triumph worldwide. Listen to the following words from an article in The Australian on Monday following the Paris outrage by Niall Ferguson, Professor of History at Stanford University in the USA. It is doubtless true to say that the overwhelming majority of Muslims in Europe are not violent, but it is also true the majority hold views not easily reconciled with the principles of our liberal democracies, including our novel notions about sexual equality and tolerance, not merely of religious diversity, but of nearly all sexual proclivities. Well, taking my second point, procedures for making decisions that are ethical. The second matter that I wanted to touch on, both at the personal and the corporate level, more unsatisfactory ethical decisions are made, in my experience, through poor and inadequate procedures than through following values that are simply wrong. So what does making sound or virtuous ethical decisions require? And I think this applies to most, and obviously the more significant the decision made, the more of these you'd have to consider. The first is, what are all the relevant facts? Are they true? What are the desired objectives to be achieved? Who is or is likely to be involved or affected? Are related parties or self-interest a factor? What is the right thing to do here? What rules, laws or standards apply, if any? What are the likely consequences for myself and others if the decision is implemented? If it isn't implemented, will others who follow judge the decision as fair and just? The more significant the decision, the more formally those questions should be considered, answered, and independently reviewed. I found it arising a lot in judgments following this Paris thing. People come on the air, people you talk to, they've all got judgmental opinions, most made without all the facts. And the last point is truth. So where are we left in the West? What to do? What worldview is true? We are back to the most fundamental and pressing question of all for us as humans in forming our worldviews. That is, one you have heard before, and I'm sure you've thought about, what is the meaning of life? In other words, what meaning is going to drive your worldview and your ethics? In considering the answer to that, can I briefly mention 4 different aspects of truth? Truth is veracity first. Truth in speaking. What is conveyed? Always tell the truth. Do not slander or hurt another's reputation. Truth is performance. Consistency or integrity with reality and veracity. Do not practice hypocrisy. Truth as trustworthiness, the keeping of vows, oaths and promises. And finally, truth as reality. Truth as authentic, objective reality. Things as they are, real states of affairs. It is not subjective or relativized, that which is rather than merely an opinion. In what circumstances would a positive answer to the question of the meaning of life constitute truth in the sense of being authentic, objective reality? I leave you with that question to ponder. Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. You've given us a great deal to think about. I think there is time if you would like to...
Yes.
Do you want to explain? The daughter of one of our friends wrote an essay which I think is remarkable.
It's on truth. It'll not only give you something to think about, it'll add a little bit of humour to what's been a fairly serious topic. The young lady who wrote this was in her early teens. Nobody approves of lying. God is against it. The government is against it. Church leaders are against it. Big business against it. Used car salesmen are definitely against it. Lying is the one thing that makes your mother's jaw set in that peculiar way and her eyes grow cold. No sooner did you learn to speak than you were lectured by her about telling the truth. It's a sin to lie, you were told. Honesty is the best policy, and you can trust a thief but never a liar. She went on to tell you what happened to the boy who cried wolf, and about a gullible puppet with an Italian accent and severe nasal problems. You nodded your little head wisely and thought what a good planet this was to have been born on, with its chocolate biscuits and honest inhabitants. Oddly enough, in spite of your mother's convictions, people of inspirational honesty seem a little thin on the ground. Though we all take the public or private stance that lying is a thing to be avoided, condemned and shunned, we all accept it as a natural, even inevitable part of our lives. Everybody does it with no effort and even less guilt, and everyone expects to have it done to them. It does not cause even the most upstanding of citizens to blink or blush. Until the discussion with your mother, however, it had never actually occurred to you to lie. If your mother discovered that someone had been eating crayons again or wiping chocolatey fingers on her new couch, you didn't think to look all innocent and blame your dad or the dog. And until that fateful conversation, you had never dreamed that anyone else would lie to you. Santa Claus sounded perfectly plausible. So did the news that bread crusts made your hair curl and currants helped you to see in the dark. You had no trouble swallowing the story about being brought by the stork, or believing that you indeed would be put up for adoption if you didn't put your toys away. When, like the apple landing on Newton, the truth about mankind finally does hit you, it can leave you with a major headache. With animals, it's simple. You're either part of the pack, a predator, a mate, or dinner. If one animal doesn't like another, he will say so in a way that can't be misinterpreted. A gouging of the eyes, a sharp fang in the neck, and a quick slap around the head. Life is fairly simple when you've got 4 legs and a tail. But you quickly learn that life is lonely for the little boy or girl who insults or hits anybody he or she doesn't happen to like. To become a social creature is to learn to lie with ease and grace. Only, of course, we don't call it lying, we call it diplomacy, sparing other people's feelings, being socialized. Of course, it's no trouble, we say. You haven't changed a bit, we remark. No, your wallpaper doesn't make me dizzy, we reassure. Upon venturing into the outside world, a person becomes aware very quickly that though honesty may be the best policy, it isn't the one most people use. In fact, if lies were snowflakes, we'd have the equivalent of an Alaskan winter throughout the whole world. And if that isn't bad enough, you're not even safe in your own company. We're all so good at self-deceit, you could be forgiven for assuming that it is genetically coded. No one ever understands why others accuse them of being selfish, stubborn, manipulative, or humorless. I'm not like that, am I, you ask? Not at all, yourself replies, truthfully, of course. It's as though on that fateful day in the Garden of Eden, when the words, "What apple?" were spoken, the entire course of human dishonesty was set. Your check is in the mail. My lips are sealed. The dog ate my homework, and everything is under control. People do not tell the truth if they can possibly think of something else to say. But don't worry, it's not as bad as it seems. It doesn't hurt anyone, really, believe me. Would I lie to you?
Thank you, Eric. I don't believe we've got time for questions. So let me present you with that as a token of our appreciation. And members, please join me in thanking Eric.